Most heartfelt greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen. I eagerly welcome you to Sturgeon's most premier station, Dusklight Radio. While my brother Everett is on vacation, I will be your host. The endlessly effervescent, dubiously dedicated, and magnificently morose Evelynn L. Blackwell. Thank you all for having me. Perhaps you know of us Blackwells? We hosted the first family-owned steakhouse to ever open its doors in the center of Sturgeon. The concept was great. The theme we were going for was sort of a haunted mansion you stumble into while on an acid trip after just learning that your childhood pet has been able to understand every word you've said this whole time, but the entire thing is also a musical, so, sort of a Texas Roadhouse kind of vibe. But listeners, do you know how hard owning a restaurant is? I worked there as a chef alongside Papa Caio Blackwell for quite some time, and I swear, customers come back with the rudest complaints. My steak is undercooked. I asked for medium, not bloody rare. This isn't steak, this is giant millipede. Someone I don't know that was dressed in all black just walked up to our table, threw a basket of bread rolls at me, and then left. This is all raw meat. Everyone is being served crunchy, rancid, raw meat yeah. As if that's not all the entire point of a steakhouse. It's called culture. It's for the experience, and Papa Caio and I knew that. Ugh. Food service really is no joke. And everyone is difficult to please. You won't catch me working in that industry ever again. I'd sooner lock myself away alone in the mines with Tabitha, because at least the acoustics are fabulous down there. That being said, if you're still looking for a date location for Valentine's Day, come on down to Blackwell's Bonafide Steakhouse, where there really are no bones in the steak. Blood, however, is a different story. So please, only come down if you're not going to complain about it. Anyway, I am not Dusklight's main host, but today I am its mostly dead counterpart. I'll be reading you tales that Everett and his wonderful many-legged runners collect from the far corners of Sturgeon and beyond. Some of them will make you laugh, some will make you cry, and some will teach you how to tie a taut-line hitch, send you off on a woodland expedition, give you a couple of boxes of cookies to sell, and then give you a merit badge for sharpening your first Bowie knife using only your teeth and sheer force of will. Now, before you all say it, I know that everyone's looking for an update on Clue. They're fine. Thankfully, as you can tell, I have not been wiped from the metaphysical plane, that I know of, by disengaging from my staring contest with Jackal. I might very well have, but as luck would have it, right before I was about to blink, a bolt of lightning struck the top of the radio tower, making all the lights in the station turn off. By the time it all came back on again a few moments later, Jackal was gone. Undoubtedly disappearing into a puff of green smoke and dissipating up to the oncoming storm clouds to be rained back down another day, as is one of his preferred methods of travel. And there was a message burned into the wall next to my desk that reads, "You are going to die very soon. I will reap your soul for all to see." So, you know what this means. I think I won the staring contest, listeners. Clue, of course, still hasn't moved much at all. But if I'm interpreting their body language correctly, they seem just as confused about the message as I am. I really don't have any idea who left it or why. And better yet, was it intended for me? Or my brother Everett, who usually does occupy this studio? The last time I received a message like this, through a carrier pigeon, that was sent to me in the mail, of course, with a speech bubble-shaped note placed comically beside its beak that read, "You will drown in the flood of good intentions." It turned out to have been actually meant for my houseplant. I may have misunderstood the watering instructions. It's not my fault they make those things so confusing. But here in the studio, it's just me and Clue. And they've just gained sentience. Surely they wouldn't lose it so soon. I'm gonna have to give Everett a call, just to make sure everything's okay. But in the meantime, let's get you started on our stories for this evening. We have 2 classic tales picked out for you today. The first is The Landlady by Roald Dahl, a story about a young man who finds a cozy bed and breakfast in which to spend his work retreat. And the second is The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, which takes place in a world in which every city holds an annual lottery based off an old tradition. Both of these stories will be read to you today by a mysterious entity called Lucy K, who sources say is a conglomerate of spirits hovering around a cheap microphone, wailing like 2 cats in an alleyway fighting over territory and leaving a trail of green Skittles, but only the green ones, that's very important, in their wake. Special thanks must be given first to Mandy Moe for rendering my brother Everett in the beauteous image you see when you look at our page. Really, Everett? Beauteous? And to @Nishin on Twitter for gracing you all with my spiritual beauty. Lastly, our music is provided with permission by Cryo Chamber and Vado Elements, the Nobody YouTube channel, and the Dark Somnium with gracious thanks. If you enjoy these intros and want to see more, please ensure you've got notifications on and leave a comment for every video you encounter. With that, the sun has set and dusk has crawled into the studio once more. Whether you're working, prepping to sleep, or evading the formless void that will one day consume us all, Blackwell is here to soothe your ears and captivate your soul. Now, close your eyes and take a deep breath. The scene has been set and the light is on. It's time to walk towards it. Billy Weaver had traveled down from London on the slow afternoon train, with a change at Reading on the way, and by the time he got to Bath, it was about 9 o'clock in the evening, and the moon was coming up out of a clear, starry sky over the houses opposite the station entrance. But the air was deadly cold, and the wind was like a flat blade of ice on his cheeks. "Excuse me," he said, "but is there a fairly cheap hotel not too far away from here?"
Try the Bell and Dragon," the porter answered, pointing down the road. "They might take you in. It's about a quarter of a mile long on the other side."
Billy thanked him and picked up his suitcase and set out to walk the quarter mile to the Bell and Dragon. He had never been to Bath before. He didn't know anyone who lived there. But Mr. Greenslade at the head office in London had told him it was a splendid town.
"Find your own lodgings," he had said,
"and then go along and report to the branch manager as soon as you got yourself settled." Billy was 17 years old. He was wearing a new navy blue overcoat, a new brown trilby hat, and a new brown suit, and he was feeling fine. He walked briskly down the street. He was trying to do everything briskly these days. Briskness, he had decided, was the one common characteristic of all successful businessmen. The big shots up at the head office were absolutely fantastically brisk all the time. They were amazing. There were no shops on this wide street that he was walking along, only a line of tall houses on each side, all of them identical. They had porches and pillars and 4 or 5 steps going up to their front doors, and it was obvious that once upon a time they had been very swanky residences. But now, even in the darkness, he could see that the paint was peeling from the woodwork on their doors and windows, and that the handsome white facades were cracked and blotchy from neglect. Suddenly, in a downstairs window that was brilliantly illuminated by a street lamp not 6 yards away, Billy caught sight of a printed notice propped up against the glass in one of the upper panes. It said, "Bed and breakfast." There was a vase of yellow chrysanthemums, tall and beautiful, standing just underneath the notice. He stopped walking. He moved a bit closer. Green curtains, some sort of velvety material, were hanging down on either side of the window. The chrysanthemums looked wonderful beside them. He went right up and peered through the glass into the room, and the first thing he saw was a bright fire burning in the hearth. On the carpet in front of the fire, a pretty little dachshund was curled up asleep, with its nose tucked into its belly. The room itself, so far as he could see in the half-darkness, was filled with pleasant furniture. There was a baby grand piano and a big sofa and several plump armchairs, and in one corner he spotted a large parrot in a cage. Animals were usually a good sign in a place like this, Billy told himself. And all in all, it looked to him as though it would be a pretty decent house to stay in. Certainly it would be more comfortable than the Bell and Dragon. On the other hand, a pub would be more congenial than a boarding house. There would probably be beer and darts in the evenings and lots of people to talk to. And it would probably be a good bit cheaper, too. He had stayed a couple of nights in a pub once before, and he had liked it. He had never stayed in any boarding houses, and, to be perfectly honest, he was a tiny bit frightened of them. The name itself conjured up images of watery cabbage, rapacious landladies, and a powerful smell of kippers in the living room. After dithering about like this in the cold for 2 or 3 minutes, Billy decided that he would walk on and take a look at the Bell and Dragon before making up his mind. He turned to go, and now a queer thing happened to him. He was in the act of stepping back and turning away from the window when all at once his eye was caught and held in the most peculiar manner by the small notice that was there. Bed and breakfast, it said. Bed and breakfast, bed and breakfast, bed and breakfast. Each word was like a large black eye staring at him through the glass, holding him, compelling him, forcing him to stay where he was and not to walk away from that house. And the next thing he knew, he was actually moving across from the window to the front door of the house, climbing the steps that led up to it, and reaching for the bell. He pressed the bell. Far away in a back room, he heard it ringing, and then at once, it must have been at once, because he hadn't even had time to take his finger from the bell button, and a woman was standing there. Normally, you ring the bell and you have at least half a minute's wait before the door opens. But this dame was like a jack-in-the-box. He pressed the bell, and out she popped. It made him jump. She was about 45 or 50 years old, and the moment she saw him, she gave a warm, welcoming smile. "Oh, please, come on in," she said, pleasantly, holding the door wide open, and Billy found himself automatically starting forward. The compulsion, or, more accurately, the desire to follow after her into that house, was extraordinarily strong. I saw the notice in the window," he said, holding himself back. "Yes, I know." "I was wondering about a room." "Oh, it's all ready for you, my dear," she said. She had a round pink face and very gentle blue eyes. "I was just on my way to the Bell and Dragon," Billy told her. "But the notice in your window just happened to catch my eye." "My dear boy," she said, "why don't you come in out of the cold?" "How much do you charge?" 5 and 6 pence a night, including breakfast." It was fantastically cheap. It was less than half of what he had been willing to pay. "If that is too much," she added, "then perhaps I can reduce it just a tiny bit. Do you desire an egg for breakfast? Eggs are expensive at the moment. It would be 6 pence less without the egg." 5 and 6 pence is fine," he answered. "I should very much like to stay here." "I knew you would. Do come in." She seemed terribly nice. She looked exactly like the mother of one's best school friend welcoming one into the house to stay for the Christmas holidays. Billy took off his hat and stepped over the threshold. "Just hang it there," she said, and let me help you with your coat." There were no other hats or coats in the hall. There were no umbrellas, no walking sticks, nothing. "We have it all to ourselves," she said. "It isn't very often I have the pleasure of taking a visitor into my little nest." The old girl is slightly dotty, Billy told himself. But at 5 and 6 pence a night, who cares about that? "I should have thought you'd be simply swamped with applicants," he said politely. "Oh, I am, my dear, I am. Of course I am. But the trouble is that I'm inclined to be just a teeny-weeny bit choosy and particular, if you see what I mean."
Yes.
"Everything is always ready, day and night in this house, just on the off chance that an acceptable young gentleman will come along. And it is such a pleasure, my dear, such a very great pleasure when now and again I open the door and I see someone standing there who is just exactly right." She was halfway up the stairs, and she paused with one hand on the stair rail, turning her head and smiling down at him with pale lips. "Like you," she added, and her blue eyes traveled slowly all the way up and down the length of Billy's body, to his feet, and then up again. On the second-floor landing, she said to him, "This floor is mine." They climbed up another flight. "And this one is all yours," she said. "Here's your room. I do hope you'll like it." She took him into a small but charming front bedroom, switching on the light as she went in. "The morning sun comes right in the window, Mr. Perkins. It is Mr. Perkins, isn't it?"
"No," he said. "It's Weaver."
"Mr. Weaver. Oh, how nice. I've put a water bottle between the sheets to air them out, Mr. Weaver. It's such a comfort to have a hot water bottle in a strange bed with clean sheets, don't you agree? And you may light the gas fire at any time if you feel chilly."
"Thank you," Billy said. "Thank you ever so much." He noticed that the bedspread had been taken off the bed, and that the bedclothes had been neatly turned back on one side, all ready for someone to get in.
"I'm so glad you appeared," she said, looking earnestly into his face. "I was beginning to get worried."
"That's all right," Billy answered brightly. "You mustn't worry about me." He put his suitcase on the chair and started to open it.
"And what about supper, my dear? Did you manage to get anything to eat before you came here?"
"I'm not a bit hungry, thank you," he said. "I think I'll just go to bed as soon as possible, because tomorrow I've got to get up rather early and report to the office."
"Very well, then. I'll leave you now so that you can unpack. But before you go to bed, would you be kind enough to pop into the sitting room on the ground floor and sign the book? Everyone has to do that because it's the law of the land, and we don't want to go breaking any laws at this stage of the proceedings, do we?"
She gave him a little wave of the hand and went quickly out of the room and closed the door. Now, the fact that this landlady appeared to be slightly off her rocker didn't worry Billy in the least. After all, she not only was harmless, there was no question about that, but she was also quite obviously a kind and generous soul. He guessed that she had probably lost a son in the war or something like that, and had never gotten over it. So a few minutes later, after unpacking his suitcase and washing his hands, he trotted downstairs to the ground floor and entered the living room. His landlady wasn't there, but the fire was glowing in the hearth, and the little dachshund was still sleeping soundly in front of it. The room was wonderfully warm and cozy. "I'm a lucky fellow," he thought, rubbing his hands. "This is a bit of all right." He found the guest book lying open on the piano, so he took out his pen and wrote down his name and address. There were only 2 other entries above his on the page, and as one always does with guest books, he started to read them. One was a Christopher Mulholland from Cardiff. The other was Gregory W. Temple from Bristol. "That's funny," he thought suddenly. "Christopher Mulholland. It rings a bell." Now, where on earth had he heard that rather unusual name before? Was it a boy at school? No. Was it one of his sister's numerous young men, perhaps? Or a friend of his father's? No, it wasn't any of those. He glanced down again at the book. Christopher Mulholland, 231 Cathedral Road, Cardiff. Gregory W. Temple, 27 Sycamore Drive, Bristol. As a matter of fact, now we came to think of it, he wasn't all that sure that the second name didn't have almost as much of a familiar ring about it as the first. Gregory Temple, he said aloud, searching his memory. Christopher Mulholland. Oh, such charming boys, a voice behind him answered, and he turned and saw his landlady sailing into the room with a large silver tea tray in her hands. She was holding it well out in front of her, as though the tray were a pair of reins on a frisky horse. They sound somehow familiar, he said. They do. How interesting. I'm almost positive I've heard those names before somewhere. Isn't that queer? Maybe it was in the newspapers. They weren't famous in any way, were they? I mean, famous cricketers or footballers or something like that? Famous? She said, setting the tea tray down on the low table in front of the sofa. Oh no, I don't think they were famous. But they were extraordinarily handsome, both of them, I can promise you that. They were tall and young and handsome, my dear. Just exactly like you. Once more, Billy glanced down at the book. Look here, he said, noticing the dates. This last entry is over 2 years old. It is? Yes, indeed. And Christopher Mulholland's is nearly a year before that. More than 3 years ago. Oh, dear me, she said, shaking her head and heaving a dainty little sigh. I would never have thought about it. How time does fly away from us all, doesn't it, Mr. Wilkins? It's Weaver, Billy said. W-E-A-V-E-R. Of course it is, she cried, sitting down on the sofa. How silly of me. I do apologize. In one ear and out the other. That's me, Mr. Weaver. You know something? Billy said. Something that's really quite extraordinary about all this? No, dear, I don't. I not only seem to remember each one of them separately, so to speak, but somehow or another, in some peculiar way, they both appear to be sort of connected together as well. As though they were both famous for the same sort of thing, if you see what I mean. Like Dempsey and Tunney, for example, or Churchill and Roosevelt. How amusing, she said. But come over here now, dear, and sit beside me on the sofa, and I'll give you a nice cup of tea and a ginger biscuit before you go to bed. You really shouldn't bother, Billy said. I don't mean you to do anything like that. He stood by the piano, watching her as she fussed about with the cups and saucers. He noticed that she had small, white, quickly moving hands and red fingernails. I'm almost positive it was in the newspapers I saw them, Billy said. I'll think of it in a second, I'm sure I will. There is nothing more tantalizing than a thing like this, which lingers just outside the borders of one's memory. He hated to give up. Now, wait a minute, he said. Wait just a minute. Mulholland. Christopher Mulholland. Wasn't that the name of the Eton schoolboy who was on a walking tour through the West Country and then all of a sudden... Milk? She said. And sugar? Yes, please. And then all of a sudden... Eton schoolboy, she said. Oh, no, my dear, that can't possibly be right. Because my Mr. Mulholland was certainly not an Eton schoolboy when he came to me. He was a Cambridge undergraduate. Come over here now and sit next to me and warm yourself in front of this lovely fire. Your tea's all ready for you. She patted the empty place beside her on the sofa, and she sat there, smiling at Billy and waiting for him to come over. He crossed the room, slowly, and sat down on the edge of the sofa. She placed his teacup on the table in front of him. There we are, she said. How nice and cozy this is, isn't it? Billy started sipping his tea. She did the same. For half a minute or so, Neither of them spoke. But Billy knew that she was looking at him. Her body was half turned towards him, and he could feel her eyes resting on his face, watching him over the rim of her teacup. Now and again he caught a whiff of a peculiar smell that seemed to emanate directly from her person. It was not in the least unpleasant, and it reminded him... well, he wasn't quite sure what it reminded him of. Pickled walnuts? New leather? Or was it the corridors of a hospital? "Mr. Mulholland was a great one for his tea," she said at length. "Never in my life have I seen anyone drink as much tea as my dear, sweet Mr. Mulholland." "I suppose he left fairly recently?" Billy said. He was still puzzling his head about the two names. He was positive now that he had seen them in the newspapers. In the headlines. "Left?" she said, arching her brows. "But my dear boy, he never left. He's still here. Mr. Temple is also here. They're on the 3rd floor, both of them together." Billy set down his cup slowly on the table and stared at his landlady. She smiled back at him, and then she put out one of her white hands and patted him comfortingly on the knee. "How old are you, my dear?" she asked. 17. 17! She cried. "Oh, it's the perfect age. Mr. Mulholland was also 17. But I think he was a trifle shorter than you are. In fact, I'm sure he was. And his teeth weren't quite so white. You have the most beautiful teeth, Mr. Weaver. Did you know that?" "They're not as good as they look," Billy said. "They've got simply masses of fillings in them in the back." "Mr. Temple, of course, was a little older," she said, ignoring his remark. "He was actually 28. And yet I never would have guessed if you hadn't told me, never in my whole life. There wasn't a blemish on his body." "A what?" Billy said. "His skin was just like a baby's." There was a pause. Billy picked up his teacup and took another sip of his tea. Then he set it down again gently in its saucer. He waited for her to say something else, but she seemed to have lapsed into another of her silences. He sat there staring straight ahead of him into the far corner of the room, biting his lower lip. "That parrot," he said at last. "You know something? It had me completely fooled when I first saw it through the window from the street. I could have sworn it was alive." "Alas, no longer." "It's most terribly clever the way it's been done," he said. "It doesn't look in the least bit dead. Who did it?" "I did." "You did?" "Of course," she said. "And have you met my little Basil as well?" She nodded towards the dachshund curled up so comfortably in front of the fire. Billy looked at it, and suddenly he realized that this animal had all the time been just as silent and motionless as the parrot. He put out a hand and touched it gently on the top of its back. The back was hard and cold, and when he pushed the hair to one side with his fingers, he could see the skin underneath, grayish-black and dry, and perfectly preserved. "Good gracious me," he said. "How absolutely fascinating." He turned away from the dog and stared with deep admiration at the little woman beside him on the sofa. "It must be most awfully difficult to do a thing like that." "Not in the least," she said. "I stuff all my little pets myself when they pass away. Will you have another cup of tea?" "No, thank you," Billy said. The tea tasted faintly of bitter almonds, and he didn't much care for it. "You did sign the book, didn't you?" "Oh, yes." "That's good, because later on, if I happen to forget what you were called, then I can always come down here and look it up. I still do that almost every day with Mr. Mulholland and Mr. Temple," Billy said. "Gregory Temple. Excuse my asking, but haven't there been any other guests here except them in the last 2 or 3 years?" Holding her teacup high in one hand, inclining her head slightly to the left, She looked up at him out of the corners of her eyes and gave him another gentle little smile. "No, my dear," she said. "Only you." The morning of June 27th was clear and sunny, with the fresh warmth of a full summer day. The flowers were blossoming profusely, and the grass was richly green. The people of the village began to gather in the square between the post office and the bank around 10 o'clock. In some towns, there were so many people that the lottery took 2 days and had to be started on June 26th. But in this village, where there were only about 300 people, the whole lottery took only about 2 hours, so it could begin at 10 o'clock in the morning and still be through in time to allow the villagers to get home for noon dinner. The children assembled first, of course. School was recently over for the summer, and the feeling of liberty sat uneasily on most of them. They tended to gather together quietly for a while before they broke into boisterous play, and their talk was still of the classroom and the teacher, of books and reprimands. Bobby Martin had already stuffed his pocket full of stones, and the other boys soon followed his example, selecting the smoothest and roundest stones. Bobby and Harry Jones and Dickie Delacroix, the villagers pronounced his name Delacroix, eventually made a great pile of stones in one corner of the square and guarded it against the raids of the other boys. The girls stood aside, talking among themselves, looking over their shoulders at the boys, and the very small children rolled in the dust or clung to the hands of their older brothers or sisters. Soon the men began to gather, surveying their own children, speaking of planting and rain, tractors and taxes. They stood together, away from the pile of stones in the corner, and their jokes were quiet, and they smiled rather than laughed. The women, wearing faded house dresses and sweaters, came shortly after their menfolk. They greeted one another and exchanged bits of gossip as they went to join their husbands. Soon the women, standing by their husbands, began to call to their children, and the children came reluctantly, having to be called 4 or 5 times. Bobby Martin ducked under his mother's grasping hand and ran, laughing, back to the pile of stones. His father spoke up sharply, and Billy came quickly and took his place between his father and his oldest brother. The lottery was conducted, as were the square dances, the teenage club, the Halloween program, by Mr. Summers, who had time and energy to devote to civic activities. He was a round-faced, jovial man, and he ran the coal business, and people were sorry for him because he had no children and his wife was a scold. When he arrived in the square, carrying the black wooden box, there was a murmur of conversation among the villagers, and he waved and called, "Little late today, folks." The postmaster, Mr. Graves, followed him, carrying a 3-legged stool, and the stool was put in the center of the square, and Mr. Summers set the black box down on it. The villagers kept their distance, leaving a space between themselves and the stool, and when Mr. Summers said, "Some of you fellows want to give me a hand?" there was a hesitation before 2 men, Mr. Martin and his oldest son, Baxter, came forward to hold the box steady on the stool while Mr. Summers stirred up the papers inside it. The original paraphernalia for the lottery had been lost long ago, and the black box now resting on the stool had been put into use even before Old Man Warner, the oldest man in town, was born. Mr. Summers spoke frequently to the villagers about making a new box, but no one liked to upset even as much tradition as was represented by the black box. There was a story that the present box had been made with some pieces of the box that had preceded it, the one that had been constructed when the first people settled down to make a village here. Every year after the lottery, Mr. Summers began talking again about a new box, but every year the subject was allowed to fade off without anything's being done. The black box grew shabbier each year. By now it was no longer completely black, but splintered badly along one side to show the original wood color, and in some places, faded or stained. Mr. Martin and his oldest son, Baxter, held the black box securely on the stool until Mr. Summers had stirred the papers thoroughly with his hand. Because so much of the ritual had been forgotten or discarded, Mr. Summers had been successful in having slips of paper substituted for the chips of wood that had been used for generations. Chips of wood, Mr. Summers had argued, had been all very well when the village was tiny, but now that the population was more than 300 and likely to keep on growing, it was necessary to use something that would fit more easily into the black box. The night before the lottery, Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves made up the slips of paper and put them into the box, and it was then taken to the safe of Mr. Summers' coal company and locked up until Mr. Summers was ready to take it to the square next morning. The rest of the year, the box was put away, sometimes one place, sometimes another. It had spent 1 year in Mr. Graves' barn, and another year underfoot in the post office, and sometimes it was set on a shelf in the Martin grocery, and left there. There was a great deal of fussing to be done before Mr. Summers declared the lottery open. There were the lists to make up, of heads of families, heads of households in each family, members of each household in each family. There was the proper swearing in of Mr. Summers by the postmaster as the official of the lottery. At one time, some people remembered, there had been a recital of some sort, performed by the official of the lottery, a perfunctory, tuneless chant that had been rattled off duly each year. Some people believed that the official of the lottery used to stand just so when he said or sang it. Others believed that he was supposed to walk among the people. But years and years ago, this part of the ritual had been allowed to lapse. There had been, also, a ritual salute, which the official of the lottery had had to use in addressing each person who came up to draw from the box. But this also had changed with time. Until now, it was felt necessary only for the official to speak to each person approaching. Mr. Summers was very good at all this. In his clean white shirt and blue jeans, with one hand resting carelessly on the black box, he seemed very proper and important as he talked interminably to Mr. Graves and the Martins. Just as Mr. Summers finally left off talking and turned to the assembled villagers, Mrs. Hutchinson came hurriedly along the path to the square, her sweater thrown over her shoulders, and slid into place in the back of the crowd. "Clean forgot what day it was," she said to Mrs. Delacroix, who stood next to her, and they both laughed softly. "Thought my old man was out back stacking wood," Mrs. Hutchinson went on, "and then I looked out the window when the kids was gone, and then I remembered it was the 27th and came a-running." She dried her hands on her apron, and Mrs. Delacroix said, "You're in time, though. They're still talking away up there." Mrs. Hutchinson craned her neck to see through the crowd, and found her husband and children standing near the front. She tapped Mrs. Delacroix on the arm as a farewell, and began to make her way through the crowd. The people separated good-humoredly to let her through. 2 or 3 people said, in voices just loud enough to be heard across the crowd, "Here comes your Mrs. Hutchinson," and "Bill, she made it after all." Mrs. Hutchinson reached her husband, and Mr. Summers, who had been waiting, said cheerfully, "Thought we were going to have to get on without you, Tessie." Mrs. Hutchinson said, grinning, "Wouldn't have me leave my dishes in the sink now, would you, Joe?" And soft laughter ran through the crowd as the people stirred back into position after Mrs. Hutchinson's arrival. "Well, now," Mr. Summers said, soberly, "guess we better get started, get this over with, so as we can get back to work. Anybody ate here?" "Dunbar," several people said. "Dunbar, Dunbar." Mr. Summers consulted his list. "Clyde Dunbar," he said. "That's right. He's broke his leg, hasn't he? Who's drawing for him?" "Me, I guess," a woman said, and Mr. Summers turned to look at her. "Wife draws for her husband," Mr. Summers said. "Don't you have a grown boy to do it for you, Janie?" Although Mr. Summers and everyone else in the village knew the answer perfectly well, it was the business of the official of the lottery to ask such questions formally. Mr. Summers waited with an expression of polite interest, while Mrs. Dunbar answered. "Horace is not but 16 yet," Mrs. Dunbar said regretfully. "Guess I gotta fill in for the old man this year."
"Right," Mr. Summers said.
He made a note on the list he was holding. Then he asked,
"Watson boy drawing this year?"
A tall boy in the crowd raised his hand. "Here," he said. "I'm drawing for my mother and me." He blinked his eyes nervously and ducked his head as several voices in the crowd said things like,
"Good fellow, Jack,"
and "Glad to see your mother's got a man to do it."
"Well," Mr. Summers said, "guess that's everyone. Old man Warner make it?"
"Here," a voice said, and Mr. Summers nodded. A sudden hush fell on the crowd as Mr. Summers cleared his throat and looked at the list.
"All ready?" he called. "Now I'll read the names, heads of families first, and the men come up and take a paper out of the box. Keep the paper folded in your hand without looking at it until everyone has had a turn. Everything clear?"
The people had done it so many times that they only half listened to the directions. Most of them were quiet, wetting their lips, not looking around. Then Mr. Summers raised one hand high and said, "Adams?" A man disengaged himself from the crowd and came forward.
"Hi, Steve," Mr. Summers said.
And Mr. Adams said, "Hi, Joe." They grinned at one another, humorlessly and nervously. Then Mr. Adams reached into the black box and took out a folded paper. He held it firmly by one corner as he turned and went hastily back to his place in the crowd, where he stood a little apart from his family, not looking down at his hand.
"Allen," Mr. Summers said. "Anderson. Bentham."
"Seems like there's no time at all in between lotteries anymore," Mrs. Delacroix said to Mrs. Graves in the back row. "Seems like we got through with the last one only last week." "Time sure goes fast," Mrs. Graves said.
"Clark? Delacroix?"
"There goes my old man," Mrs. Delacroix said. She held her breath while her husband went forward.
"Dunbar,"
Mr. Summers said, and Mrs. Dunbar went steadily to the box while one of the women said, "Go on, Janie," and another said, "There she goes." "Where next?" Mrs. Graves said. She watched while Mr. Graves came around from the side of the box, greeted Mr. Summers gravely, and selected a slip of paper from the box. By now, all through the crowd there were men holding the small folded papers in their large hands, turning them over and over nervously. Mrs. Dunbar and her two sons stood together, Mrs. Dunbar holding the slip of paper.
"Harbert? Hutchinson?"
"Get up there, Bill," Mrs. Hutchinson said, and the people near her laughed.
"Jones?" "They do say," Mr. Adams said to Old Man Warner, who stood next to him, "that over in the North Village they're talking of giving up the lottery."
Old Man Warner snorted.
"Pack of crazy fools. Listening to the young folks. Nothing's good enough for them. Next thing you know, they'll be wanting to go back to living in caves. Nobody work anymore. Lived that way for a while. Used to be a saying about lottery in June, corn be heavy soon. First thing you know, we'd all be eating stewed chickweed and acorns. There's always been a lottery," he added petulantly. "Bad enough to see young Joe Summers up there joking with everybody."
"Some places have already quit lotteries," Mrs. Adams said.
"Nothing but trouble in that,"
Old Man Warner said stoutly.
"Pack of young fools." "Martin?"
And Bobby Martin watched his father go forward.
"Overton? Percy?"
"I wish they'd hurry," Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. "I wish they'd hurry." "They're almost through," her son said. You get ready to run tell Dad,
Mrs. Dunbar said. Mr. Summers called his own name and then stepped forward precisely and selected a slip from the box. Then he called, "Warner?"
77th year I've been in the lottery,
Old Man Warner said as he went through the crowd.
77th time.
"Watson?" The tall boy came awkwardly through the crowd. Someone said,
Don't be nervous, Jack.
and Mr. Summers said, "Take your time, son." "Zanini?" After that, there was a long pause, a breathless pause, until Mr. Summers, holding his slip of paper in the air, said, "All right, fellows." For a minute, no one moved, and then all the slips of paper were opened. Suddenly, all the women began to speak at once, saying,
Who is it? Who's got it?
"Is it the Dunbars? Is it the Watsons?" Then the voices began to say,
It's Hutchinson. It's Bill.
"Bill Hutchinson's got it,"
Go tell your father.
Mrs. Dunbar said to her oldest son. People began to look around to see the Hutchinsons. Bill Hutchinson was standing quiet, staring down at the paper in his hand. Suddenly, Tessie Hutchinson shouted to Mr. Summers,
You didn't give him enough time to take any paper he wanted. I saw you. It wasn't fair.
"Be a good sport, Tessie," Mrs. Delacroix called. And Mrs. Graves said,
All of us took the same chance.
"Shut up, Tessie," Bill Hutchinson said. "Well, everyone," Mr. Summers said, "that was done pretty fast. And now we've got to be hurrying a little more to get done in time." He consulted his next list. "Bill," he said, "you draw for the Hutchinson family. You got any other households in the Hutchinsons?"
There's Dawn and Eva,
Mrs. Hutchinson yelled.
Make them take their chance.
"Daughters draw with their husbands' families, Tessie," Mr. Summers said gently. "You know that as well as anyone else."
It wasn't fair,
Tessie said.
I guess not, Joe.
Bill Hutchinson said regretfully.
My daughter draws with her husband's family. That's only fair. And I've got no other family except the kids.
"Then, as far as drawing for families is concerned, it's you," Mr. Summers said in explanation. "And as far as drawing for households is concerned, that's you too. Right?"
Right,
Bill Hutchinson said. "How many kids, Bill?" Mr. Summers asked formally.
3.
Bill Hutchinson said.
There's Bill Jr. and Nancy and little Dave and Tessie and me.
"All right then," Mr. Summers said. "Harry, you got their tickets back?" Mr. Graves nodded and held up the slips of paper. "Put them in the box then," Mr. Summers directed. "Take Bill's and put it in."
I think we ought to start over,
Mrs. Hutchinson said as quietly as she could.
I tell you, it wasn't fair. You didn't give him enough time to choose. Everybody saw that.
Mr. Graves had selected the 5 slips and put them in the box, and he dropped all the papers but those onto the ground, where the breeze caught them and lifted them off.
Listen, everybody,
Mrs. Hutchinson was saying to the people around her. "Ready, Bill?" Mr. Summers asked, and Bill Hutchinson, with one quick glance around at his wife and children, nodded. "Remember," Mr. Summers said, "take the slips and keep them folded until each person has taken one. Harry, you help little Dave." Mr. Graves took the hand of the little boy, who came willingly with him up to the box. "Take a paper out of the box, Davy," Mr. Summers said. Davy put his hand into the box and laughed. "Take just one paper," Mr. Summers said. "Harry, you hold it for him." Mr. Graves took the child's hand and removed the folded paper from the tight fist, and held it while little Dave stood next to him and looked up at him wonderingly. "Nancy next," Mr. Summers said. Nancy was 12, and her school friends breathed heavily as she went forward, switching her skirt, and took a slip daintily from the box. "Bill Jr.?"
Mr. Summer said. And Billy, his face red and his feet overlarge, nearly knocked the box over as he got a paper out.
Tessie?
Mr. Summer said. She hesitated for a minute, looking around defiantly, and then set her lips and went up to the box. She snatched a paper out and held it behind her.
Bill,
Mr. Summer said, and Bill Hutchinson reached into the box and felt around, bringing his hand out at last with the slip of paper in it. The crowd was quiet. A girl whispered, "I hope it's not Nancy." And the sound of the whisper reached the edges of the crowd.
It's not the way it used to be,
Old Man Warner said clearly.
People ain't the way they used to be.
All right, Mr. Summer said. Open the papers. Harry, you open little Dave's. Mr. Graves opened the slip of paper, and there was a general sigh through the crowd as he held it up, and everyone could see it was blank. Nancy and Bill Jr. opened theirs at the same time, and both beamed and laughed, turning around to the crowd and holding their slips of paper above their heads.
Tessie?
Mr. Summers said. There was a pause, and then Mr. Summers looked at Bill Hutchinson, and Bill unfolded his paper and showed it. It was blank.
It's Tessie,
Mr. Summers said, and his voice was hushed.
Show us her paper, Bill.
Bill Hutchinson went over to his wife and forced the slip of paper out of her hand. It had a black spot on it, the black spot Mr. Summers had made the night before with a heavy pencil in the coal company office. Bill Hutchinson held it up, and there was a stir in the crowd.
All right, folks,
Mr. Summers said.
Let's finish this quickly.
Although the villagers had forgotten the ritual and lost the original black box, they still remembered to use stones. The pile of stones the boys had made earlier was ready. There were stones on the ground with the blowing scraps of paper that had come out of the box. Mrs. Delacroix selected a stone so large she had to pick it up with both hands, and turned to Mrs. Dunbar. "Come on," she said. "Hurry up." Mrs. Dunbar had small stones in both hands, and she said, gasping for breath, "I can't run at all. You'll have to go ahead, and I'll catch up with you." The children had stones already, and someone gave little Davy Hutchinson a few pebbles. Tessie Hutchinson was in the center of a cleared space by now, and she held her hands out desperately as the villagers moved in on her. "It isn't fair," she said. A stone hit her on the side of the head. Old Man Warner was saying,
Come on, everyone."
Steve Adams was in the front of the crowd of villagers, with Mrs. Graves beside him. "It isn't fair! It isn't right!" Mrs. Hutchinson screamed. And then they were upon her. Welcome back, listeners. My, what a pair of stories. A little morbid, perhaps, but that's quite common in our trade. The wheels of time turn ever onward, slower than we'd like and faster than we'd hoped. These authors seem to know that as well as we do. And yet, what have we really learned from its message? Oh, the lightning thing? Yeah, don't worry about that. Thanks to the memory curse I gave myself in culinary school, I forgot that "You are going to die very soon, I will reap your soul for all to see" is the name of a rock band I used to like back in high school. After some very calm, very strategic screaming, and only a few frantic phone calls, I figured out that Tabitha was just inviting me to a concert of theirs. She would have come in herself, except that she's a little busy dealing with the great murmuring beneath the Earth's crust right now, so she just got a lightning rider to do it. You know, like a sky rider, except... yeah, you get it. Anyway, no harm done and nothing to worry about. I am very excited for this concert now, though. I've just got to run home and grab my orange cowboy hat, my neon pink fishnet tights, and my Wolverine spikes, and we should be all set. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out some of our other transmissions. We're adding them regularly, and we'd love to have you as part of the Dusklight family by subscribing, hitting the bell of the great pestilence in the sky that hovers above us all, and leaving a comment with stories you love for Everett's many-legged runners to find. Now, while I apply some eyeliner in the shape of a man being slowly transformed into an oak tree that will be chopped down 104 years later to make room for a Pizza Hut. That's the band's logo. Let's thank our lovely Sturgeonite faithfuls. Haley Clark, Foe, PRDDL12, Sabrina Alexander, Jason Webb, and Laree W. Purple Crayon Eaters Mary Peck, Square, Gianni Di Lorena, Feeny Von Karma, and Max, who are currently taking the wrappers off some of the crayons in their hoard and tearing them up into tiny little pieces to create some strange papier-mâché depiction of a lion mid-pounce. Their art class must be going well. Janitors Alex Nunez, Amy Sean, Ethan Nelson, and Arkham Cookie, who are boosting morale for their latest strike by working even harder than they were before, so that now everything is far, far too clean. Our nightmare detective, Adrian Rodriguez, who dumped a stack of case files onto my desk yesterday, said, "Here, you investigate this one. I am swamped. Swamped, I tell you," and left. So, does that mean I'm a detective now too? Our Voidwalker, Evan Diaz, who is currently sitting in front of the television and having a rap battle with one of the characters from Mission Impossible. I think he's winning, but it's going to be a tough call. And of course, our Blackwell family members. Clue Blackwell, whose body language now suggests that they want to read a chapter from Charlotte's Web. Here you go, Clue. I think I'm getting better at this whole interpretation thing. Tabitha Blackwell, who ran into a family of moles down in one of the tunnels the other day and has invited every single one of them to the concert too. And on an unrelated note, power outages are occurring all over town from numerous rogue lightning strikes, so, might want to unplug your devices, listeners. Jackal Blackwell, who is probably part of the air you're breathing right now. Isn't the water cycle just wonderful? And our Lord of Blood and Bone, Papa Kaio Blackwell, who this week has decided to fully integrate himself with humanity and blends in perfectly with his new human disguise. He could, in fact, be lurking among any one of you right now. Watch your backs, listeners, and remember to refuse all sales pitches just in case. We love you and fear you, Papa. We thank you humbly for your patronage and look to see you bright and early for Dusklight orientation. Purple crayons and existential dread will be provided. If you want to be a patron, we have a link in the description below. You'll get early access to all videos, exclusive Sturgeon-focused D&D and Monster of the Week content, and more. And one last time, listeners, close your eyes and breathe with me. Remember, no matter how bad things are, how cruel people can be, and how heavy your shoulders may feel with the weight of the world bearing down on them, Dusklight will always be here to lift the load and provide you with some respite. Drink a fruit punch Capri Sun, have some dino-shaved nuggies, watch your very favorite music video, and sleep on the cool side of the pillow with the window open and the stars twinkling down on you. Start and end each day with kindness in your heart. You matter. You are loved. And every day is another chance. I've had a wonderful time here on Dusklight Radio these past few broadcasts, and I'm sure I'll see you all one day soon, when the sun sets and dusk enters the station.